We are proud to welcome Dr. Heather Callaway for tonight's Lyceum series. Dr. Callaway joins us from Indiana University, and I appreciate you making time for us today. I'm going to help cheat and pull up the biography you kindly sent. Welcome you here today. You are Heather Callaway is Executive Director of the University Collections at Indiana University, with responsibility for the stewardship of IU's collections. This year, she founded the Center for Fraternal Collections and Research, which collects, preserves, and makes accessible historical and cultural materials related to fraternal organizations and their memberships, with emphasis on the organizations which are extinct or without stable historical repositories. Heather spent 14 years with Scottish Rite House of the Temple in Washington, D.C. as museum curator and managing director of digital and social media. Under her direction, new approaches to museum tours, exhibit, and collection access were instituted as a renewed interest in the public, as people started to get interested in Freemasonry. Heather Callaway is a native New Mexican from Albuquerque with a doctorate in higher education management from the University of Pennsylvania. And I'll add, Freemasonry has been in her family. Both her father and her husband are brothers. So with that, I hand it over to you, Heather, and thank you for being here again.
All right, thank you, Micah. I'm going to share my screen here. Is that working? Yep. Okay.
Yep. You're good.
All right. So good evening, everybody who's joining us. And I really appreciate the opportunity to talk tonight. Micah and I go way back. We've known each other for many years and always have spent time imagining and dreaming how we could save all of the fraternal stuff. So I really appreciate that you guys invited me to talk tonight and be able to share some of the cool things that we've been saved everywhere. So I'd like to start with a story for those that Nebraska might or might not know. So most of our audience tonight would be from Nebraska. So the Grand Master of Masons of Nebraska in 1877 was George Washington Linenger, and he was a businessman and civic leader in Omaha. He began collecting artwork early in life and eventually had so much that he added a gallery to his home. And you can see in this picture here, this is what his home looked like. The collection included more than 300 works of art. There were 60 paintings by old masters. Linenger paid the government of Egypt to be present at the opening of a tomb. He even arranged for 10 tons of ancient Egyptian goods to come: statuettes, mummified hawks, carved masks, 2 full human mummies, to be shipped back to Omaha for display at the Omaha Public Library. So this guy, he actually, of course, he was a member. So he joined Freemasonry in 1856, and by the 1880s, he had one of the most complete Masonic libraries in the world, especially in early recorded proceedings of an English Grand Lodge. He wanted to study Masonry in Europe. So as he was doing so, he also collected all of this artwork. This grew into the most extensive collection in the state of Nebraska. So when he was being interviewed, he once said of his artwork, "What is an art gallery for, but to let your friends see it? And I consider anyone who has love for art as my friend, and I am glad of the opportunity of inviting him to my gallery." So what happened to this collection? This is an image of some of the things that he would have had back then. And legend has it that the Freemasons supposedly were going to inherit parts of this valuable collection. But upon his death, all of the collections were willed to his widow, Caroline. When she died, many of the items in the collection were given to friends across Nebraska, and the collection was broken apart and sold. Some objects are now located at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. There's about 200 artifacts from the estate. Grand Lodge officers in the 1940s decided that they didn't have enough space to properly store these items, and those of John J. Monell. They loaned these items to the university for safekeeping, where they remain today. Others have made their way back to the Joslin Art Museum in Omaha, and a few of his fabled books, originally constituting one of the finest collections in Masonry, are now among the collection of Freemasons of Nebraska. So I'm often asked, how did you get into studying this stuff? I've been doing this my whole life, and I just wanted to give you a little bit of a story on how I got into this. So this is the Masonic Temple in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and was at the time. And basically what happened here was there was a fire. As we know, in many West Coast lodges and churches around the country, there were lots of fires that happened and priceless artifacts were lost. But they were having a dance one night, and it was a Demolay dance. And so Demolay, Jobs, and Rainbow Girls were here, and a fire broke out, not because of the members, but it was an electrical fire. And the kids rescued the artifacts. So the Grand Lodge was located in this building, and the kids ran in and saved what they could of the archives and other artifacts in this building. And one of those kids just happened to be my dad. And so growing up in my family, Masonry just was something we did. It was part of day to day. We watched the temple being built in a different temple being built in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So I grew up with this, and saving history was just a really big part of my life. I never knew or dreamed that that would actually be something that I could grow into a career. But just it's kind of cool looking back now and hearing the stories of this fire and the rescue of the artifacts, and that now that's what I'm spending my time doing now. So after, so I really spent a lot of time in Albuquerque learning about different Masonic and fraternal things, and it was just a curiosity at that time. I went to school at the University of New Mexico and studied religious studies, and then I moved on to the University of Denver and Iliff School of Theology, where I thought I wanted to be a religious studies professor. And that turned out not to be the case, because I fell in love with the research that I was doing with all of the professors. And I really saw that there was another career out there. But I went ahead and finished my degree at seminary. And my last semester of study, I moved to Washington, D.C. So I was in Denver and I moved to DC, and I had enough time that I only had so many classes. So I said, I'd love to be able to volunteer at the House of the Temple. I had grown up looking at the magazines and the pictures and calendars and all that cool stuff that they send out talking about the House of the Temple. And I said, it would just be so cool. I'm only here for a semester. I would love to volunteer. And so our personal representative in Santa Fe, the Valley of Santa Fe, connected me to the librarian there at the House of the Temple, and I was able to volunteer. And after a week, they said, hey, you're working really hard here. We're going to give you a paycheck too. And so I was only supposed to be here for a semester, but I really fell in love with what I was doing there at the House of the Temple. And this was 2001. And absolutely loved what I was doing in the library. And for those of you that haven't seen this magnificent building, I encourage you, when you go to Washington, D.C., to stop in, take a tour. It's free. And it's one of the most magnificent buildings I've been in the Washington, D.C. area. But this is the library. So imagine just being a graduate student and then being allowed to and getting to catalog these books. So my first job here at the House of the Temple was to catalog books. And they were old books. They were spread all over the building, and we wanted to organize them and put them into some sort of order and in a collection. Specifically, these belong to one of the great Masonic scholars of the 19th century. You might have heard of him, Albert Pike. They were also the books that made up the first public library open, the first library open to the public in the District of Columbia. So this was really unique because at the time, libraries were only, you had to pay to go to libraries. There weren't libraries open to the public like we know today as a public library. So this became the original library open to the public in DC. And it wasn't a Masonic library at that time. This would have been novels and science and religion and philosophy and things like that. So yes, there was a small Masonic section, but this would have been a general collection that Pike would have gathered as his personal library back then. But as I was cataloging these books, I found handwritten notes in the margins. Each was in the language of the text of the book. That experience was really amazing, and I was hooked. So I started as a cataloger, and then they found out that that I was good at a lot of other things, and so they threw other jobs and positions in my lap. And so I worked with the mailroom, worked with the Scottish Rite store. I worked with the philanthropy, the Right Care Philanthropy. I worked with all the conferences, the Fellows Program, and many other things that came, that evolved over the time that I was there. And one of the things I'm the most proud of when I was there was creating the internship program. So Mr. Seal, who was the Grand Commander at the time, he came down to my office. My office was in the basement, full of collections, all kinds of stuff. I had started working with the museum at this point and trying to, catalog and organize the artifacts. They were all over the building. They were in every closet, every drawer, everywhere. So we'd been organizing these artifacts, and Mr. Seal said to me, he said, Heather, what good are all these artifacts and all these collections if nobody's coming to see them? And so I really took that to heart. And he had bothered me and asked me over and over if I would help him reinvent our tours at the House of the Temple. And I said, well, I don't want to. I want to work with the collections. And he said, well, again, if people aren't going to come see them, then what are you doing with your time? Excuse me. So I went home and realized this was a really important thing. And he showed me that the tour guide books at the time, there was no internet with like tour information or anything like that at the time. So there were tour books. And so when you would go on a trip to California or Europe or wherever, you go get a tour book at your bookstore, and it would tell you all the cool sites to see. Well, when it was talking about the House of the Temple, it said that we were the worst tour in Washington, D.C. And the reviews were terrible. And so he showed me these different books. He had picked up a couple different kinds. And he said, Heather, we have to do something about this. And so I agreed with him. We absolutely had to change these tours. And so we hired college students to augment our tour guides who were members of the organization. And we redid the tour, we rewrote it. And then we also started working on changing some of the exhibits and things like that. And so these are some of my very first interns. So we reached out to all the colleges in the area and hired the students from everywhere, from GW to Georgetown to American University to Maryland, Catholic, a little bit of everywhere. And then we also had people that would come in the summer from all over the country, and they'd come live in DC and work as summer interns. And I'm really glad that we did this internship program, and then we got this going and off the ground and really had it going well, because in 2009, this guy wrote a book, and it just happened to be that it opened and closed in our building. And for those of you that have been following lately, obviously this has now been made into a TV show, and so you might be following along on TV to see this. But I was really glad we had started this intern program before this book came out, because my job changed overnight. The college intern program helped us to survive this. We also had to hire additional security and all kinds of extra people because we were not, I mean, Dan Brown made the House of the Temple popular, and really overnight, my job changed. So I love that experience. It was amazing. We became noticed by the Smithsonian as one of the hidden gems in Washington, D.C., as well as many other Washington, D.C. publications that covered the tour and what we were doing with the exhibits in the museum and things like that. It was really exciting. So even though my job had completely changed from what I thought I was going to do, it was so much fun. So my most frequent question that I get working with special collections, so over 20 years now, I've worked with all kinds of different special collections. And my most frequent question is, my group, my church, my club, my lodge is moving. We're selling our building. We're closing. What are we going to do with all of our stuff? So it is that question which I'm the most passionate about, to helping others to discover an answer. So with this, I really started to look into how to preserve all of these artifacts, because I would get called from widows, members, little church ladies that had, you know, all the marriages and deaths and births and all the things that had happened in their church. And they're like, our church is selling. What do we do? What do we do with all these records? What do we do? We've got these, you know, amazing artifacts that have been donated. So I really looked into what's going to happen to these kind of things. We have countless rare, priceless treasures. Most of them were in collections that people didn't even know what they had. So they call me up and say, Heather, I have a bunch of boxes. I have some stuff in a closet. I don't know how to take care of it. I don't even know if it's valuable. So this kind of thing is something that happens a lot with special collections. And it became something that really became my passion. And the people didn't even know some of these things are valuable. So print collections are one of the most difficult things to convince administrators to keep, because now that everything is going digital and we're in this digital age, libraries and keeping books and things like that has become something that we have to really explain why something like this might be relevant and why we should still preserve this kind of thing. So, and with Freemasonry, what you're looking at here is a typical Masonic Bible. So, and there is absolutely nothing different about this Bible other than the fact that it has a square and compass on the cover. And inside, they usually have a page where people would put their membership information. Sometimes it was a gift during a ceremony, and so different officers might sign the inside, but there's absolutely nothing different with what's inside this thing. And Freemasonry has its own collection of Americana material culture. These kind of physical materials provide scholars with objects and artifacts that trace the story of fraternalism in American society. And as the first and oldest fraternal order, all other fraternal organizations are modeled after the success of the Freemasons. So the rise of fraternalism in America has been an important part of the American story, as is the recent decline in civic engagement, including membership in fraternal organizations. So the story of Freemasons in America is then an essential part of American history. So you might ask, for those of you that haven't studied this before, what is Heather talking about? So I really enjoy show and tell. So that is what I'm going to show you right now. So some of this material culture I'm going to show you and tell you about. So this Bible is one that was part of one of the collections I worked with. Again, it is just a common Bible. And you might be surprised to learn, but this was the most common thing that people tried to donate to us, is a Bible. And they come in all kinds, with all different kinds of the Masonic appendant bodies stamped on the front or the cover. This one just happens to be with the square and compass from the 30s. So again, I said that the Bible is our most donated thing. So this would have been in the collections, and I think this one's from New Jersey. So Grand Lodge in New Jersey, and they just had stashed tons and tons of Bibles that they've been given over the years. And this was in a supply room, as well as Masonic encyclopedias. So if you've ever been to some of your local lodges, you can see multiple encyclopedia sets if you're lucky. So another thing that we often find are the old past masters. So lots of lodges, if you have not been in a lodge before, have pictures of their past masters. And they might be in the wall in the room where you have dinner, or they might be somewhere else around the lodge, but this is very common. And I'm often asked about how to preserve these kinds of images. Sometimes they're trying to update to add the new ones, or they have so many that they don't know what to do with them. So they have had to take them off the wall. And so I've worked with lodges on preserving the photographs and making sure that they're available for future generations. So I always enjoy photographing these when I go on my tours. So we got lots of porcelain. This can be found at many of the Masonic groups, especially from the 20th century. So, and you can see in this picture, we have all different symbols on them, and those are the different symbols from the different organizations. And back in the day, everyone got their own china with their own stamp in their lodge and different numbers on them, and that was very common. Not so much nowadays, but the lodges that had bought them back in the day still definitely use these. So these, while I consider them an artifact, they aren't always considered an artifact. So once again, just ledgers and minutes and records. So for me, these are one of the most valuable thing that lodges have. And lodges don't realize, you know, a lot of, you know, secretaries take their minutes and they keep notes, and then they put it on a shelf, maybe in the secretary's office, if you're lucky to have one. And then this just accumulates. But a lot of lodges don't have the ability to take care of this stuff. Well, these are unique records. And so I find these one of the most valuable things to acquire and save and preserve, because this is the only record of those events and those meetings that was ever taken. And unlike nowadays, where we type it up on our computer and we might email it out and we might read the minutes in a different way, they hand wrote these during the meetings, and after the meetings they might have, you know, finished up, but and then they would read the minutes at the next meeting. So these are super valuable. Also, lots of membership information in these kind of ledgers. And this one happens to be from the Rathbone Museum, which I'll mention a little bit more throughout this time. So aprons, jewels, gavels, those are very common, and there's a book here as well. But you can see these in just about any Masonic lodge. These ones happen to be some ones I got to work with at the House of the Temple. So we would change up our exhibits and talk about the history of these items. So I love this. This is from my friend Tyler, and this is a fraternal fez and a trench rat, and from the 1970s. So fezzes were very common in the 20th century, and lots of different groups. So people usually associate their Shriners with these, but there are many other fraternal groups that had fezzes. And if you want to check out a really cool site, the Fez Museum is just Google Fez Museum. My friend Seth takes care of that and manages it, and has a wonderful explanation of all the different fezzes, the different groups, fraternal organizations that use them, and then beautiful pictures of them. So one of my favorite things to work with are the Regalia. So Scottish Rite Valley costumes, especially from the turn of the last century, early to mid 1900s, are really priceless. And they don't typically fit, or they're threadbare for people in this day and age. So lots of Scottish Rite Valleys have these, but don't necessarily use them anymore. So preserving these kind of costumes from the different companies that made these is something that I'm really passionate about. These ones were sent to the House of the Temple from a valley that was merging, and they didn't know what to do with them, and the other valley didn't need them. And so we did not have some costumes at the time. So since the House of the Temple is at headquarters, there isn't any ritual that was occurring there. So we were able to obtain some really wonderful costumes from the 30s. So, and similarly, this is a House of the Temple's apron collection, and this came with the collection that I just showed you. And these have the different degrees. So Scottish Rite degrees with aprons and the different symbols of each degree on those aprons. And it's hand painted. And these are really amazing and in really good condition. Most Scottish Rite Valleys in the southern jurisdiction do not use aprons. So that's probably why these are in such good shape, because it's just not a normal thing to utilize these. Most degrees use the costumes of the degree versus an apron. So back in the day, when they would do ritual, they would use slides. And so we have lots of slides. So they're little glass slides that have different degree work on them. And so tracing boards is something that would be a little bit more modern. And nowadays, of course, we have PowerPoint slides that have the same kind of symbols and things that would have been taught back in the day. But lots of old lodges have these old projectors and slides where they would have used for the different lessons that they were teaching with the degrees. So this one is, I love this scrapbook. So that the front of it is, hand done, and it's got the big metal clips on the side and then photographs of Shriners. It's just super cool. And so I love when I'm able to find these kind of treasures with the guys wearing their fezzes, which is really great. Lots of Masonic groups have charters. So these happen to be at the House of the Temple in the archives. There are over 2 million things in the archives at the House of the Temple. And these just happen to be two. I opened a drawer and took a picture. And you can see, if you look really closely there, some famous people's names. And it's kind of cool to just to be able to see those kind of things. These are located usually at the valley level. So valleys might frame it and hang it on the wall. That's probably one of the worst things you can do with it, but that's usually what people do with it. These are in a map case, so these ones are safe and out of light and out of potential damage. This one is just a degree sign from one of the valleys that I visited, and I love that these kind of things are still around. So I love showing props. So this was just inside a case, and you can see we've got some skulls, we've got some gavels, a few other things, and these are all just things that they would have used in and still do use in the different rituals. So this one I happened to find, and this one, the person that was doing the degree work wrote cheat notes on his hand so that he wouldn't forget his ritual. So I loved this, and I just had to take a picture of it because that's pretty cool cheat sheet. And this is a Grand Commander's jewel. So this was Grand Commander Coles, who was back in the 1930s, 40s, 50s at the House of the Temple. So I love how ornate this is, but this is just one. This is like a super grand example of one of the jewels. We had many, 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 many jewels, and people, whether they're made of gold and diamond and stuff like that, which this one is, to just pot metal. There's every kind you imaginable. And nowadays you might be more likely to find a lapel pin versus one of these. So, but I love showing this one off. So one of the things, I was working at the House of Temple, and I really realized that something was going to happen with, all these other lodges and things around the country. So we worked with people from around the country and around the world. And they kept calling me and saying, hey, we're downsizing. Our Blue Lodge is moving. I have more stuff. How do I deal with it? And so I went back to school and studied at the University of Pennsylvania and got my doctorate in higher education management, because when I really looked into this about what was going to happen to the artifacts, I realized that a lot of these things would end up in higher education. And the reason they go to higher ed is because they were some of the few that had the ability with the staff and storage to be able to collect and preserve these kind of things. So one of the reasons I left the House of the Temple was because I saw that if I wanted to make an impact in the future, I needed to be in higher ed. And so I went back to higher ed and not only got my doctorate and studied at a management level, but physically went back to working in libraries, archives, and museums, because I realized I could hopefully make a difference to save some of this history. And absolutely loved being back in higher ed. I love working with students, college students, and teaching them and getting people passionate about doing this as well for their future. So I've been fortunate that I believe that I can improve the fate of these collections. And with some of my colleagues, we've really been able to work towards saving this kind of history. And one of the first places that we came across, and this might have been 6 or 7 years ago, was the Rathbone Museum. And it is in Lafayette, Indiana. And these are some of the costumes and things that they have there. So they have been collecting every kind of fraternal organization possible. So Ken Motor is their director and guru guy there. Absolutely enjoy working with him and his team. And so some of my colleagues and I had been introduced to him, and we started helping him with his museum and artifacts there. And it's been really great because I feel like we could make a difference on actually preserving this kind of history. And these are, as you can see here, these are a lot like the costumes that I showed you of the Scottish Rite, but these ones are the Oddfellows. But you can tell they look very similar. The same kind of companies made and marketed to different fraternal organizations the same costumes. So you can see and study the different costumes and see that, like, the judge might be the same costume in multiple, if they had a judge role in multiple organizations. So I'm going to skip that, but one of the things that we decided after working with Ken at the Rathbone Museum, we decided to start the Historical Society for American Fraternalism. And so a group of Oddfellows, Masons, and museum types got together, and we created this organization. You can go visit our website and enjoy reading about every kind of fraternal organization imaginable. So we have compiled kind of a wiki where you can look up the different organizations and read about them and study. We also have a great social media presence, and we share lots of photographs and pictures of artifacts where we talk about every kind of group imaginable. So we started this as a way to begin to preserve preserve these organizations' history. And we partnered with Ken at the Rathbone Museum because he already had an amazing collection of things. And so we didn't really want to collect things ourselves. It's already being done. But we saw that there was really an avenue to also increase the ability to reach people and have space to continue to collect these kind of things long term. So in the last year, we've also created the Center for Fraternal Collections and Research. And that is here at Indiana University. And we just started it this year, so we're just getting going. But similar to the Rathbone Museum, we are working hand in hand with them and trying to help preserve the organization's history from around the country and potentially beyond. But right now we're focusing here in America. So in the States, there's lots of great, amazing treasures that people have written us about and called, and we're already really excited. We're just starting our board and getting going this fall. So I just wanted to close with a quick story. So when I was working at the House of the Temple, I was asked to create a display for one of our museum galleries. And our artifacts, like I said earlier, were all over the building. We were still getting them organized and taking them out of wherever they were packed and stored. And so they were in tattered old boxes and literally everywhere. But in one cabinet, I pulled out a piece of decorated fabric. And as I unfolded it, an index card fell to the floor. And the textile was a satin and silk Masonic collar. And the card read, "Worn by President and illustrious brother, Harry S. Truman." Wow. He had served as Grand Master of Masons in Missouri in 1940 and 41. So discovering President Truman's Masonic collar tucked in a shelf in the basement of the House of the Temple was a once in a lifetime experience for me. So I really believe that I am doing exactly what I should be doing and starting these organizations that I just mentioned to you to preserve fraternal history will help us to ensure that treasures like this collar last beyond our own lifetimes. So, and I just love to show this because the Dumoulin Museum is our friends in Illinois in Greenville have some amazing treasures as well. So I love showing their skeleton. So just a last thing, but thank you. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to entertain them.
There's a question. What can lodges do? We've all got copies of, you and I've joked about 1,000 copies of Morals and Dogma, Mackey's Encyclopedia, Coyle's. With lodges that have records, what's the best way to preserve this stuff? I guess what's the fundamental thing we can do since we can't get archival boxes or Mylar for old documents, is putting them on a shelf and keeping them out of heat, light, and humidity the best we can do, or is there a better thing we can do?
So I would really say that case by case, it would depend on which kind of item we're talking about. So definitely if it's paper and it's paper based, I would not be keeping it in a attic or a basement. So a lot of times we stick stuff away because we're like, oh, we're done with that old ledger or that old minute book. And so then we put it in an old closet in an attic. Well, the heat is going to destroy that thing. Or we put it in a basement. Now, if we've got basements, it's probably going to leak. So really being able to make sure it's in a dry, safe place. I would try to get it some sort of box or file to keep stuff in. That's just to keep the dust and other potential bugs or pests away from it. Books are a different story. So it really depends on how much space a place has. A lot of lodges don't have the space to keep a giant library full of encyclopedias. So it would really depend on how much space someone had. Lots of lodges I've been to as well don't have air conditioning. So that sounds crazy in this day and age, but lots of them never put it in back in the day. And so that's a really difficult thing because everything has the potential for humidity, mold, pests. So just trying to keep it in a stable environment. So not lots of fluctuation between hot and cold and hot and cold, and keep away from the basement and the attic.
I can tell you some of the interesting things that I've seen found in our lodges. They found a program from 1917 in Alliance, Nebraska, when the Scottish Rite purchased the lodge and retrofitted it for their purposes. Warren Harding autographed it, and congratulations to the new lodge. They found a original photograph in a beautiful frame of Grand Commander Frederick Weber in Hastings, which now hangs in the lobby of the building. A charter to the Valley of Kearney, which no longer is long gone, signed by Albert Pike in 1880s. So neat stuff turns up, and I'm glad a lot of the lodges are displaying it and letting it be seen rather than stay in closets or attics.
And I could say you could digitize things, but that would just, you could digitize about anything, but that's not just the answer. We've got to also take care of the original artifact, whatever that might be.
We've got a question from Jim Marples, who's from the Lincoln Valley and lives in Texas. Albert Pike was a Mason and Oddfellow member, as Jim is. What is the most unique or little-known writing you know of written by Pike? Is it a letter, a note? Pike willed his 33rd degree ring to Marshall Wood in Idaho. Do you know where Pike's ring is now?
Question. So most of his things are at the House of the Temple. I don't know specifically about that ring, but there is a whole room at the House of the Temple where we took all of his books. Some librarian back in the day, this is before all of the people that work there now, they decided to spread his collection throughout the library. So as they got new books, they just kept adding them to the library and they just got cataloged in with the rest of it. Well, when I was there in 2001, we started to pool all of his books and we took them and cataloged them separately and then put them in the Albert Pike Memorial Room. And this was a great way to really see what this author, basically what he was using, what his personal library was. And I don't know about favorite or most unique, but if you go and see this room, there are all kinds of personal artifacts of his. He did live in Charleston, South Carolina, and then in Washington, D.C. as well. But they've got his boots, they've got pipes. He liked to smoke, so he has lots of pipes. But what I think was the coolest when I got to catalog those books was really in the margins of those books, he wrote in the language of the books. And so just, taking a random book off the shelf, of course, with the librarian's permission, because they're fragile and old. Many of them are leather. And so the leather is really difficult to keep from falling apart and turning into rot. And so, but just looking at the texts of those books, it's cool to see his handwriting. Now, the coolest things that they have, though, are in the archives. So you would have to work with Art, who's the historian and archivist there, and work through him to be able to look at those, to access the archives. But the most beautiful stuff really is handwritten and in the archives there.
Micah, there's another question from David Bloomquist. I'm trying to pull it up here. And David writes, David, has one of the very few existing copies of the local college fraternity ritual that later merged with his national fraternity, written by Roscoe Pound. What would you, Heather, suggest David do to preserve this, or where to donate it?
Oh, that's cool. So those are the most unique. Like when I showed you the picture with all those books that were ledgers and things like that, those are the kind of things that are one of a kind. There is no other copy of that. What you've got is really, in my mind, priceless. It's not worth a lot of money. It's priceless in that you can't replace that kind of history. So honestly, there's a couple organization. Well, I would give it to, first of all, I would definitely get it digitized, or I would digitize it myself. And the second thing, that the most appropriate home for that is probably whatever national fraternity it folded into. And if that's not in existence anymore, then our center is something that is collecting that kind of thing. So,
Heather, a point of clarification. When you say get it digitized, what exactly do you mean?
Well, it depends on what you are dealing with. So books, papers, photographs, things like that. There are professionals that do this, so you can take it to a professional. The biggest thing with digitizing something, if you just have a home scanner that you have on your desk, that may not be good enough
Right.
to make a high enough resolution copy. So that would be a great way to do it really quickly, so that in case anything happened to it, or for like an insurance, to have an extra copy. But definitely, I would consult professionals on getting a high quality digital copy of something like that. And then something that we do, one thing about just digitizing it, well, then you have to keep up with re-digitizing it or making sure the file is still accessible. So as you know, just a few years ago, we had, thumb drives. Well, I can't use a thumb drive anymore. My
Right.
computer doesn't have a USB stick. And definitely everything that was on a CD or a DVD, or especially floppy disks. People are still bringing me floppy disks. Well, how can you get on that? And yes, there's special equipment so we can get those files off that, but just digitizing it is not the answer. So really
Right.
keeping up with what are our most rare things. Let's digitize it as a backup, but then also rechecking every couple years to make sure that those files are still the most modern thing we could have.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that thumb drives are going out, because I have about 100 of those. So there's another question from Nick Furkert. I hope I'm saying your last name correctly, Nick. For lodges and valleys with museum spaces already set up, what would you recommend with preserving those items, or how could we better keep these items?
Well, so I don't know the specifics of your particular lodge, but I've seen many grand lodges across the country, as well as blue lodges, York rites, Scottish rites. I've seen a little bit of everything. So, making sure that things are safe. So in some sort of case, just because I've seen theft. So I'd rather keep it safe in some sort of display case. A lot of these places are not air conditioned. So again, if it can be in an air conditioned space, that is the best thing you could do.
Right.
A lot of them are, all over the country. I just see artifacts, they are going to disintegrate. So whether it's an apron or a paper, or they're going to mold depending on where they are in the country, because of the lack of proper HVAC. So deferred maintenance on the building is a problem everywhere. So, making sure you're taking care of your lodge. So if you take care of your lodge, then your artifacts inside are also going to be preserved for a longer time. So just making sure they're safe, not in lots of temperature fluctuations. I agree with what Micah said earlier. I'm the kind of person that I want people to enjoy the history and experience it and learn it and be able to touch it, so to speak. But I don't want it just in the archives forever. But if we had a letter from George Washington, we're not going to put that out where everybody knows. So, the letter from George Washington, make a facsimile of it, have that out and say, it's in the vault with our, whatever, in our safe or in our vault. But the things that are, more common, those can be out where people can really enjoy them. So it really depends case by case based on what your artifacts are.
There's one more question, and hopefully more will be on their way. T.S. Akers asks kind of a technical question. How do you preserve silk aprons or maintain those that have shattered?
Yeah. So textiles are the most difficult of all the things in fraternal collections to preserve. So whether it's an apron or a hat or a costume, they eventually textiles will disintegrate no matter what you do. When I started at the House of the Temple, the aprons, they had they have an amazing apron collection. And somebody had decided that it would be really smart to keep them safe. They would sew them to poster board. So these silk aprons and other leather and other materials, but especially these silk, were sewn onto poster board. And they would write a little caption on the side, not on the apron, but on the paper. And that is one of the worst possible things they could have done with these things. At least they were flat. So keep it flat, store it flat. I would make it or buy it an archival box from an archival supply company. Basically, the silk, you would have to, it just falls apart. It falls apart in your hand. So you could have someone sew new parts on it, but keeping it more originals or authentic would probably be what I would do. So these silk ones that we had at the House of the Temple, I worked with a bunch of interns and we took them off of the poster board. We sat there with tiny little scissors and took all of the hand stitches out of the poster board, got it off the board. We got some archival boxes and we kind of handmade some folders out of acid-free paper, and we put them inside of those. You could also put them in a map case flat and then put them in, make sure you have acid-free material. So you could use tissue, you could use, they sell paper that's larger sized. So it's kind of like almost like a poster board, but it's acid-free. So, but don't sew it to it. So you can put that. There's also different Mylars and things that you could put in between it, but I prefer the tissue and the acid-free boards because you want to kind of keep it stable. Those things, sadly, hanging the costumes is the worst thing you can do with them. So they should be stored flat as well. So aprons, but who has room to store, hundreds of costumes or even, 2 or 3 closets full of flat? That's just impossible. So really picking your most special things and identifying those and then trying to invest in some acid-free boxes and paper. Those are the best way to store them. And keeping them out of light, heat, temperature change as well. I'm not sure if that answered your question.
I find it interesting that, this organization that you've just started for the preservation of fraternal artifacts, no one has done that yet. And so it's kind of mind-boggling to think of all the artifacts that have already been lost because of that. So I guess it's more of a statement than a question, but so thank you for your foresight.
I've worked with Mark Tabbert and Seth Anthony for the last 6-7 years, so I cannot take all the credit myself. Mark Tabbert and I have worked, he literally works at the George Washington Masonic Memorial across the river from where I was at the House of the Temple, and we've been colleagues and friends for years. And so this kind of was a dream that we just kept thinking up. We knew that Freemasonry specifically has wonderful museums and archives and libraries. So whether you're talking about the House of the Temple, the Memorial, the Scottish Rite Northern Jurisdiction in Lexington, or some of our Grand Lodges are really amazing, whether it's New York or California or Iowa. There's really some Pennsylvania. I mean, I could go on and on. Texas. I don't want to leave people out, but there's some really amazing Grand Lodges that are able to fund and staff. So that's the key. Lots of our Grand Lodges have these cool museums, but they don't have the ability to pay staff and people, professionals. And I don't mean like a brother that is a really nice volunteer. I mean people that train to do what I did. There aren't those kind of people. And that's why I saw that these fraternal things, if people were going to save them other than possibly the Smithsonian, and my friend Tim works there. He's the fraternal curator there. And Mark and I have gone to visit him and seen how many fraternal artifacts the Smithsonian has, and it's a handful. So Tim would tell you, he would say, sadly, there are millions and millions of things at the Smithsonian. We can only saved so many fraternal things. So they have a very small collection. The House of the Temple and the Memorial and the Northern Jurisdiction have way more artifacts than the Smithsonian, believe it or not. So it's something that I really saw, and Mark and Seth and our other friends and colleagues have seen. The stuff's going to end up in the trash, or especially ephemera. So ephemera is something that was created that was really meant to be thrown away. So I'm going to show you something here. So here's a postcard that would be ephemera, a bookmark. These are not Masonic. These are just some I got in the mail. But people don't always keep stuff like this. So one of the things that in the Masonic and fraternal world that are the most valuable, so to speak, to me, are all of those newsletters that were sent out for years and years and years. So we have all these cool newsletters that Little Lodge XYZ published and sent to just their members. Well, it's super hard to find that kind of stuff. The House of the Temple has an absolutely amazing periodical section with a lot of these, and Iowa as well. But so many times people, you got your monthly newsletter and you went to your meeting and then you threw it away. So if somebody saved that kind of thing, it's super rare.
Right. Can I ask, where do you expect to get your funding for your organization?
That's my job now. So
right.
now we've got to fundraise. So we're just now telling people about ourselves. We got our website up and running. I have a place, like a building and storage, and Indiana University will support us as well with some money, but they want some match. So that's up to me to fundraise for that now.
That's the fun part. Right. Well, I'm going to invite Micah back in to see if you, Micah, have any other questions before we sign off here. I think it's only right that that we give the last word to you, Micah, since you're the person responsible for bringing what I believe to be our best presentation that we've had in over, we've been doing this, Heather, for a year, and you're top of the line as far as I'm concerned. This has been fantastic.
I appreciate you coming, Heather, and making time. I've got questions and could ask all day long. But in the interest of time, I just simply want to say thank you for your expertise and being the save our stuff expert for Masonry.
Right.
Sure. And tell people, I have my, this is my email address, super easy to remember. Anyone can talk to me. I'm happy to, I always want to cover, like, how do you save all these kind of things? But that's a whole presentation in itself. So people ask me, like, you just asked me about textiles, paper, all these other things. I could do a whole presentation on, here's how you physically take care of those kind of things.
You shouldn't have said that.
So
we're going to call you again.
But you can feel free to email me with specific questions, because so many people have like a certain artifact or a certain item, and they're like, here, and I'm happy to either meet via Zoom or email and look at pictures and kind of offer some advice. The best thing you can do is really to talk to professionals like me who can offer advice. We're always more than willing to talk about, we love what we do. So we're more than willing to talk about how to save these and preserve these artifacts and things. It's just what we do. So.
Well, thank you very much. And we probably will be, getting in touch with you again. I've found this just fascinating. And it takes a special person to do this kind of work. So thank you for all the time and all the effort you put into dusty old manuscripts and things like that. It does take a special person. So Micah, you've got the last word.
Well, just to give everyone a quick heads up on what we have coming up next, we have Bob Davis, who's Grand Master of Masons in Oklahoma, 33rd degree, Grand Cross, and more Masonic titles than I could even imagine. He will be speaking. He's a noted author, publisher, but I think he's going to talk about manhood and masonry. In November, we have Matt Zamoski, who works for House of the Temple, but he's going to speak about the 300 years of the Grand Lodge of Virginia. He is Grand Junior Deacon. And then back to historic preservation. In December, Dr. Wendy Wassett-Barrett is speaking. She is an expert on theatrical drops, particularly Scottish Rite drops. And she's done consulting work in Omaha, Hastings. She's visited Hastings and notably Santa Fe and quite a few other valleys. And she's going to talk about both the history of Scottish Rite scenic drops and how we can preserve and protect them, because they're so central to our fraternity. So keep coming back on the last Monday of each month and join us. Let me turn it